Greetings, APUSH scholars, for the review for Unit 9 on the Gilded Age. And remember, this is this period of industrial growth at the tail end of the 1800s, characterized by the growth of monopolies, urbanization, growing cities, increased immigration, an increased standard of living for most people, but a very large growing number of exploited workers, leading to the growth of labor unions. I'm looking through the review sheet here for our test from the top to bottom here. Some ideas to know: laissez-faire, the idea that the government should keep its hands off of industry, off of business, off of commerce. Government should be neutral. Social Darwinism versus Marxism. Social Darwinism is the idea survival of the fittest applies to society as it does in nature. And regarding the poor and the rich, this is what you need to know for the purposes of our test here. A social Darwinist would look at the poor and say they need to work harder, and success is possible if they work hard, or they need to stop their unfit behavior. And the rich, on the other hand, have worked hard. The rich deserve their wealth. They are fit by definition because they're on top. The Marxist would look at things the opposite. The Marxist would look at poverty and wealth in terms of class struggle, and they would say that the factory workers, which Marx would call the proletariat, are the poor. They're exploited, they're oppressed, they're underpaid, overworked, and the rich have essentially stolen their labor. They've stolen the fruit of their labor, the wealth that they have created. Monopolies and trusts. A monopoly is a business that controls the production of a product for which there is no close substitute. And a trust, for our purposes, is essentially the same thing. It's a legal run around the idea of a monopoly. Some examples here would be Carnegie Steel Mills, Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company, which at one time proposed here to own most of the railroads in the Pacific Northwest. And Carnegie's business, of course, was steel, and he used the Bessemer process to great profit for himself. And his book, The Gospel of Wealth, more like an essay, is a social Darwinist track in which he justifies his wealth, the wealth of those who have succeeded as deserved. And in it, he lays out his plan for philanthropy, which is to give back to the community, give back to those who are willing to help themselves. And he spent lots of money donating libraries and building concert halls and parks and things like this, where people could lift themselves spiritually and lift themselves educationally. John D. Rockefeller is the famous oil tycoon, the creator of Standard Oil. And as far as rebates go, this is one of the ways in which he drove his competitors out of business. He would either threaten to withdraw his oil from a railway line, or he might, in another way, promise them a guaranteed amount of business on the condition that they gave him a sort of a refund under the table, a rebate. And by doing this, he was able to ship his oil cheaper than his competitors, and he drove them out of business. And he did other tactics as well, just simply taking a loss for a while to drive his competitors out of business, or laying pipelines to compete with his competitors. But rebates were one of the means by which Standard Oil took 90-95% of the national market at one time. A boss in the machine, in quotes. A boss is a big city politician. The machine is a city government. And these machine bosses are famous for basically trading immigrant votes for favors. And when these immigrants came to the shore of the United States, if you're ever wondering, how did they find a job? How did they find an apartment? How did they have emergencies met? Well, part of the answer is the city boss would have a network available to these immigrants, and in return for his help, he was expecting theirs on election day, and he typically throw a little beer fest and make that day just a nice one for these hard workers who might get the day off because of the relationship between the boss and some of the city businesses. Old versus new immigration. The old immigration is pre-1890, pre-1900, and the old immigration is primarily, and this is a big generalization here, but primarily English-speaking, people with a democratic background, Protestant. These would be Anglicans and Puritans and Lutherans from Scandinavia. And, of course, just every generalization has a big exception. That would be the Irish Catholics. But English-speaking, from democratic country background, Protestant. In appearance, the The old immigrants are lighter skinned, lighter hair, taller, generally from Western and Northern Europe. The contrast here is going to be very apparent when we get the new immigration from Eastern, Southern, and Central Europe. These are going to be from non-English speaking countries, from countries with no hint of democracy, and they're going to be largely Catholic and Jewish. So these are going, this group is going to be seen as a threat. They're going to be seen as not able to assimilate. The Chinese Restriction Act in 1882, this is an act passed largely due to West Coast racism against the Chinese, and it stopped the immigration of Chinese laborers. By 1880, 10% of California's population, about 300,000 of the Californians, were Chinese. Why did they come to America? Well, the Chinese began coming over after the 1849 gold rush, just like many other people came to California. Frederick Jackson Turner, his essay is The Significance of the Frontier in American History, and this is usually nicknamed the Frontier Thesis. And in this thesis, he says it's the West, it's the frontier that turned foreigners into Americans and created the conditions for democracy and equality. And his point here is, in 1890, the frontier has ended. There is no frontier as defined by the census as basically empty land. And the problem here are these waves of new immigrants who, in many ways, are perceived as being un-American and bringing un-American ideas. Some of them are socialists and Marxists, and they're radicals, and they're labor agitators. And on top of this, they're Catholics and Jewish and whatnot. And his fear here is that they will not fit in, that the American dream is in danger, the dream of democracy and equality, which the frontier allowed to happen. Some strikes you should know. 1877, there's a railway strike in response to the 1873 panic, which led to reduced wages. And across the country, railway yards are shut down by strikers. There was widespread violence and arson. And Rutherford B. Hayes sends the troops to knock heads together and to crush this strike. The Haymarket riot in 1886, after a strike at the McCormick factory in Chicago, the strikers meet downtown and violence breaks out, bomb is thrown, 11 people killed, 130 injured, and there's this riot. It's called the Haymarket Riot, and it's blamed on the strikers. It's blamed specifically on the Knights of Labor. And very bad publicity, and the public mood turns against labor unions after this strike. The Homestead Strike, 1892, Battle of Workers at the Homestead Mill of Andrew Carnegie. Members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers is going to have it out with these Pinkerton private hired goons, which are leading some strike breakers into the plant that they've been shut out or locked out of. 12 people are killed, and the Pennsylvania governor sends in the militia to force the factory open and to arrest and to disperse the strikers. Why did strikes fail and anti-strike tactics? I'm going to answer these two comments on the review sheet together, these 2 points. One is lack of public support. Many people felt unions were un-American. Many people felt that unions were a failure of individual initiative and assault on private property. You have court injunctions. You have the hiring of scabs. These are strike breakers. You have lockouts where the workers are locked out of the factories. You have mixing foreign workers who speak different languages so that they're not able to communicate and form a union. You have yellow dog contracts where workers would agree never to join a union. And then finally, you have the use of violence by either local police or state militia, or the Army's called out by Rutherford B. Hayes in the 70s and then later in the 90s. Grover Cleveland calls out the Army, and the pretext here is that the federal mail is being blocked by these railway strikers, and that would be in the Pullman strike in the 1890s, as well as in the 1877 railway strike across the country. The Pendleton Civil Service Act, this is in 1870. It follows the assassination of James Garfield by a petitioner who wanted a government job. And why now? Well, there's increasing desire for reform, and we'll be talking about that in the next unit, about the populists and the progressives, but this is one of these precursors, or actually one of these examples of early reform, and that is to replace this spoil system, the system of rotation, where Andrew Jackson he perfected, remember, firing those who were your political opponents and putting in your loyal friends, rewarding them. The spoil system is being replaced by a system which will give jobs by examination and by merit. At least that's the plan, and over time the vast majority of U.S. government jobs are not dished out by the party in power, but through a fair, what's called a civil service examination process. The three main unions that you need to know, the Knights of Labor, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and the International Workers of the World, their goals, their strategies, their outcomes. Think in terms of a grid. I know we did one on the board sometime in the last few weeks here. The Knights of Labor was looking for a super union, a union of all American workers, all American laborers, and they had this idea of what nowadays we'd call workers' councils. This would be cooperative management, where workers are helping to decide on the running of a factory. Not the ownership of it, but helping have a say in the management of it. And the Knights of Labor failed in after the Haymarket Riot in 1886. The American Federation of Labor had more narrow aims, more limited, and that is to organize just skilled labor, to organize craftsmen. And their basic goal here is more money, bread and butter. They don't want to have any really say in management. They want more money, bigger paychecks. And their method was to strike, and they're very successful. Successful because these are the craftsmen who you can't run a factory without. These are the electricians, and these are the engineers, and these are the pipe fitters, the people who, if they walk off the job, the assembly line shuts down. The IWW, or the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, these are a bunch of socialists. It's a socialist union, and they want to end capitalism. They want socialism as their end game, and they have the strike as their primary immediate tool. Long term, they're hoping to vote in socialist government. And they fail. Violence is called out by cops and by militiamen and by the U.S. Army. Problems leading to unions. Unions are organizations looking to better the life of workers. And what the workers want, they want higher wages, lower hours, and they want an end to child labor, and they want an end to dangerous working conditions. Child labor and Lewis Hines. Lewis Hines, remember, is this photojournalist who exposed the atrocious working conditions that young children were exposed to and forced into in textile mills and mines and fields and tenement sweatshops. The Gibson Girls. Gibson Girls are these cartoon caricatures in magazines at the time that showed this independent, active woman who's not staying home, who's not focused on cooking and cleaning and taking care of the children. So quite a contrast here with the cult of domesticity, this growing independence that women have. They're going off to work as sales clerks and as teachers and as telegraph operators. Popular literature, three names to know: Henry George, Progress and Poverty, an advocate of a single tax on land. And he publishes this book in 1879, and more copies of this book were published and purchased than any book in American history up to that time, with the exception, of course, of the Bible. Edward Bellamy, Looking Backwards, he writes this in 1888, about a decade later, and this is the bestseller in American history up to this time, with the exception, again, of the Bible, and Ben-Hur. And Ben-Hur is written between Progress and Poverty and Looking Backward. And Looking Backward is, what's the book about? You should know that. And it's basically Rip Van Winkle's story. This guy wakes up and the country's become socialist, and it's become sort of a socialist nirvana, socialist utopia, where workers are switching their work and workers are retiring early, and there's government warehouses to take from. It's a very interesting book to read. Horatio Alger is the author of these rags to riches stories, and he is writing these children's books which are being snatched up. He writes about 100 of them. It's best-selling author really between the last 30 years of the 1800s, and he is these books are going to justify the wealth of those who are successful, of the emerging middle class, the growing middle class, and these books are going to explain why some aren't succeeding. If you read the books, Ragged Dick the story Ragged Dick is this kid who's just ridiculously honest and hardworking and frugal and religious and brave and honest, and he's not like that Jimmy Nolan who's playing poker and pitching pennies in the gutter and smoking cigars and going off to vaudeville shows. So Horatio Alger is giving this template for how one succeeds, the social Darwinist trajectory of the good person, the person who's moral and hardworking. And the real-life Horatio Alger story, of course, is our man Andrew Carnegie, who's this not orphan, but he's this sorry, he's not the orphan kid. He's the immigrant kid who comes over from Scotland. His dad's an unemployed weaver, an unemployed textile worker, and Carnegie's going to work himself up from being a bobbin boy to being a telegraph operator to being a messenger boy to a telegraph operator to a secretary and a manager of a business. He's going to invest in iron and steel, and before you know it, he's this wealthy guy. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These are these two generations of black leaders. Booker T. Washington writes a book called Up From Slavery, in which he describes his becoming free and his program for black advance. And he's arguing for the pursuit of economic skills, for economic betterment. He's got a famous quote, "Agitation is folly. You're not going to make your former slave masters treat you as equals or let you vote. It's not going to happen. It's not realistic. What you need is to be able to make more money." He sets up Tuskegee. It's a vocational tech school. And the goal here is so that blacks can put more, food on their table. And he says, and he argues in his famous Atlanta Compromise speech, and he's talking to whites as well as blacks. There's whites in the audience, and he's telling them that the South will prosper and rise as long as blacks and whites rise together. And the black only wants to work hard to feed his family, and by working hard, he's going to help the whites rise. And he likens this to fingers in one hand. They're separate, but together, they have power collectively. And he's saying exactly what whites want to hear. He's not this uppity black guy who wants social equality. He doesn't want to vote. Doesn't want to sit next to white women in a theater or a bench or in a railway car. He just wants his people to work hard, and for the white guy to sort of pat him on the back and give him some money for better schools. So Booker T. Washington is the man really for his time. W.E.B. Du Bois is the author of The Soul of Black Folks. And he is one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which comes out of the Niagara movement. And he's going to argue for political and social equality for black Americans. And he's coming from an interesting background. He's not a Southerner. He's not a former slave. He's growing up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And his mother raised him alone, and she had a stroke. And he was largely cared for and supported by a lot of good white people in this town. He went to the local public school and played with white kids, and he had more of for him, what he thought was a realistic expectation that really all that black people needed was to be treated decently, and with whites have a good education, of course, but have political and social social equality. So W.E.B. and Booker are two different methods. What's the problem that the black man faces in the white man's world? Is it economic poverty or is it political inequality? And they both have answers according to how you answer that question. So there you go. That's your quick flyby review here. And study hard. Be sure to look through your book again and look through your notes, look through the PowerPoints. I have them uploaded on RunWeb on the web documents. So see you there. Signing out.